I tell you what, let me tell you, the hottest show in America is Stephen K. Bannon's War Room. He starts off every day 10 a.m., War Room 2020, and then at 11 a.m. to noon, War Room Pandemic on the John Fredericks Radio Network. I don't care what you're doing between 10 and noon. Drop it. Stop what you're doing. Got to tune in to Steve Bannon or go to his podcast if you can't make it, because he's been so far ahead of the curve on this. Weeks ago, he said this was a pandemic, and he's joining us now. Stephen K. Bannon. Steve, great to have you, man.
Thanks, John, and thanks for producing the show for us. Really appreciate it.
Once again, Steve, you're ahead of the curve. You were on impeachment. Now you are on this coronavirus pandemic. Stock market crashing yesterday, panic setting in, people even doing things like buying up all the toilet paper. What is the deal?
Well, look, the reason we did the start pandemic, I think back in January, mid-January, was that we, given my knowledge of China and all the time I spent broadcasting into China for the Chinese people, 3 days a week, we knew something was going on in a city called Wuhan, which is the size of New York City. If they eventually got to shut down an entire city of 18 million people, also in a region, they shut down a region the size of basically Italy or France with 60 to 80 million people. And when the Chinese, their total legitimacy is based upon their economic powerhouse of manufacturing and logistics, when they shut down something like that, it's serious. And so from there, and it's pretty evident, we hired and basically retained the top, experts around the country, around the world on pandemics, including Dr. Stephen Hatfield. And it was pretty obvious to us that thing was going to quickly spread throughout the world. And with that was going to come an economic crisis and potentially a financial crisis. And to me, it's not astrophysics. I mean, we've been talking about this. It's amazing. CNN just yesterday made this a global pandemic. The news you get on mainstream media and in the newspapers is stuff we literally talked about on January, 25th, 26th, 27th. And so I'm very proud of the fact that we're ahead of this. And like I said, it's not astrophysics. It's pretty straightforward how this thing's going to spread. But what's happened, and this is why I think it stuns me, and particularly conservatives who have not taken this seriously. I mean, Italy today is completely locked down. And they've had hundreds and hundreds of deaths. It's exploding every day. They've literally shut down the entire country, just like Hubei province. This is a country of 60 million people. The northern most productive section of Italy is absolutely in a crisis, and they're going to have a crisis in public health care because they don't have enough ICU beds. So this thing is very serious and needs to be taken seriously. And now it's caused a severe economic problem. That economic problem being both the hotel industry, the cruise line industry, the airplane industry, and things like Boeing. But more importantly, it's revealed the systemic problem the United States has with globalization. The first of that, and we were the first person to put Rosemary Gibson on, this woman that's done this brain analysis of how all of our drugs, all of our generic drugs, all of the, what they call APIs, the associated pharmaceutical ingredients, that we can't make aspirin, we can't make penicillin, we can't make vitamin C, that all that's made in China. Additionally, the systemic problem we have with all the major manufacturing is done in China, and the logistics chain, comes back to the United States. And so these deep economic problems that this is exposing has then led to this kind of financial crash, which, interestingly enough, looks like markets are bouncing back today. And the reason was, for the first time, President Trump took this seriously enough to really address the nation in this press conference yesterday and talked about pretty bold, dramatic action he was going to take on the fiscal side. Now, the key is to make sure that action takes place, but just his coming up for a few minutes and talking about what he was going to do on the payroll tax cut and other things to make sure that the gig economy employees were going to be able to still get paychecks was enough that it caused a rebound all night, all the way from the Asian markets to the European markets, and now it looks like a pretty strong open in the United States. However, I warn everybody that is 100% dependent upon the United States taking bold action. That's what these markets are looking for.
All right, so he's done that, but I want to get back to the virus a second. Obviously, you were way ahead of the curve on this. You said it was going to spread worldwide and affect the supply chain. Look, Steve, the geniuses in Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, the financial sector, the gangster banksters in New York, they've been telling us for years that manufacturing didn't matter. It didn't matter where this stuff was done, as long as the labor was cheap and we could buy a can of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer and save 5 cents. Now, is that not what we were told from the 1990s on? Now reality sets in. Are they going to own up to their lies?
Well, no, not only not going to own up to the lies, let's be, brutally frank. One of the ways that we kind of met, John, was my analysis of the 2008 financial crash, which, remember, the financial crash of 2008 led directly to the election of Donald Trump. That led to a populist, economic nationalist reaction that led to Donald Trump, and quite frankly, has led to Bernie Sanders. And no, Wall Street, let's be brutal, let's be honest, this fiscal stimulus is coming out of taxpayers' money. Now, you could argue you need it because the economy is now in this kind of this crisis brought on with this virus, with this deep underlying economic crisis. But the economic crisis, the huge part of the systemic part, is also brought on by Wall Street. That said, the China price is everything. And what we've argued for a long time is that the China price comes at a huge cost. And now we're paying this cost. And, it's going to be on the deplorables and the taxpayers' back. That this is all. That these bailouts are all going to be paid. Now, I'm not arguing that these things are not necessary. Some of these emergency measures, I think, are going to be necessary in order to kind of keep some stability here. But as we go through this, you're going to see once again that this is socialism for the very wealthy and the very poor, and a brutal form of capitalism for the working class and the middle class.
Basically, it's a repeat of the same policies. We're with Stephen K. Bannon. Also, you can follow Steve at Citizens AR. Stephen K. Bannon, the host of War Room 2020, 10 to 11 a.m. and War Room Pandemic from 11 to noon, Monday to Friday. Must listen radio. Sometimes he does weekends if there's something happening also.
And John, here's how this is why we bifurcated the show from the election show of 2020 in the first hour to the pandemic. And people, when I first announced pandemic, there were a lot of eye rolls. There were a lot of eye rolls in the conservative community. There were a lot of eye rolls in Washington. There were a lot of eye rolls of people I noticed that, Bannon, this is once again, your hair's on fire. And I said, no, you don't understand, that these are going to converge, that this pandemic, because it's going to expose these underlying structural economic issues that we have with globalization.
Right.
And it's also going to have a huge change into the, huge impact in the economy. That's going to converge and be actually the driving motive force in back of 2020. I mean, President Trump, and I've said this for a long time, he's not running against Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden. He's running against a virus. This is his Churchill moment. To really take command. Now, his actions very early on were quite powerful to basically limit travel from China and, most importantly, to quarantine people. The administration, for a host of reasons, particularly around this testing kit and the testing kit about how CDC developed it and deployed it, we've lost a lot of time. But I think now President Trump, you've seen a big change, or at least yesterday, that it seems like he's going to take much more command of this. And particularly on the economic and finance side. Now, Nancy Pelosi and people out there, this thing's going to have politics involved with it. She outright rejected last night, President Trump and the Democrats. There are a number of stories in the Hill and other media that the Democrats were basically rejecting his potential solutions for the financial crisis part of this and the economic crisis, and we're going to have their own package of stuff. So you're in for... the next, I got to tell you, I've never seen American history or American politics in a more urgent, must-watch, much-follow nature. But for your listeners out there, this is going to have a direct impact, not on their lives, this is going to have a direct impact on, generations to come. And so it is a time that I would say, advisedly, your spare time would be very well spent, of staying up with the news, both following things like the John Fredericks show, our show, but also going online, et cetera, and really get as much information as possible, because this is at an intensity level that's far deeper than just a normal political, presidential campaign.
Steve, yesterday you said to me, it could change America as we know it. Quantify that.
Well, first off, change America, number one, I think one of the most fundamental things is we have to have an understanding of what we actually gotten ourselves into. Mm-hmm. I mean, how these pandemics, it can spread so quickly. Dr. Hatfield has talked about these pandemics have become much more frequent since the 1990s, and that's because of globalization, because of the population density in these developing nations, particularly nations like China. And that's all because the factories all left, Southern Virginia and North Carolina, textiles, furniture, all these factories, upper Midwest, our steel, our basically industrial base was shipped to China. And what China did is take rural populations and condense them into, Wuhan is a city that is 40% bigger than New York City. And 99.99% of Americans had never heard of Wuhan until late January, early February. This is a city that's a massive, they call it the Chicago or the Pittsburgh of China on the Yangtze River. It is a massive industrial complex, and it's in a province that's bigger than the country of France or Italy. When people know France and Italy, they never heard of Hubei province, and it's an economic powerhouse, and that's just one of a number of provinces like that in China. And it's evident now that we have shipped our industrial base. We did it for this concept called the China price, so we could buy all this junk cheap at Walmarts throughout the nation, and we're now paying a price for that because there's no wisdom on Wall Street. All they think about is the lowest price and the highest stock price and the biggest margins, and don't really care about the nation. And now, as a country, we're having to confront that we're in a real jam. And part of that is in this pandemic, which can be handled, right? That's why I think President Trump, the most powerful thing he said is nothing is inevitable. Human action, but it takes American ingenuity, American smarts to kind of get ahead of this. In addition, it's this thing about this economic crisis, and then on top of it, the financial system. And I think this is exposing there's still tremendous abuses of the financial system that have not been corrected from 2008. And that's coming home. I think that's additionally going to come home to roost. And I think there's going to be an intense debate about, quote unquote, if there are any bailouts or any, you have both monetary policy and you have fiscal policy. Monetary policy is the Federal Reserve using basically the U.S. currency as some sort of solution to come up with, and the whole world looks to the Fed to kind of take leadership. Well, at the end of the day, that's all on the backs of the U.S. taxpayer. Same with fiscal policy. You're going to hear talk of the next couple of days of providing, no interest loans or the ability to keep small businesses in place, which I support. But you have to understand that that's also coming out of the U.S. Treasury. Everything that's going to be talked about the next couple of days, your listeners should just understand one thing. It's all going to rest on their shoulders, right? And this is what I keep arguing. This is why I'm a populist, that the working class people and the middle class in the United States of America, it all comes down to them. It doesn't come down to Wall Street. It doesn't come down to Washington. These guys get a free pass, and they get a free pass because they always, at the end of the day, lean on the population of this country, both their energy and how they work, and also their tax revenue, and their kids to basically go in the military and basically become the world's police force to keep all this going. And I think there's a reckoning coming, and we haven't had that reckoning yet in the Trump administration of forcing the powers in Washington and Wall Street to confront what they've done to the nation. President Trump's gone a long way to do that, but hasn't gone all the way. And I think that the reckoning is still to come. It has not come yet. It's still to come. So we're going to see. We're going to go through some very choppy water, I think, over the next couple of weeks and months. And President Trump now, I think, is fully engaged, understands that he's a wartime president with this virus and basically this economic crisis.
Steve Bannon with us, Stephen K. Bannon, War Room 2020, 10 a.m., War Room, Pandemic, must-listen radio, Monday to Friday, 11 to noon, John Fredericks Radio Network. Steve, so the virus, what you're saying is the virus, if I'm understanding it, is going to be the catalyst for the Wall Street financial system reckoning. Is that my understanding?
Well, yes, I think what we're seeing right now, remember, we had this economic crisis, a financial crisis, and on top of that, this is one thing I don't think is getting in. I know we're going to get a few minutes left. The Saudi Arabia situation. This thing kind of threw gasoline on the fire yesterday, where you had the Saudis essentially, and I believe, and now I think other people are starting to talk about this. They say it's between Saudi Arabia and Russia. I happen to think that Saudi Arabia went full gangster on the United States. This part of this was to take out. The United States is now, under President Trump, full energy dominance. We are not just energy independent, we're an energy exporter, and that's because of the great technology, ingenuity, and entrepreneurial spirit of the fracking industry in Texas, Pennsylvania, North Dakota. And what this is an attack, they basically took the oil prices and dropped them, the biggest drop in history, down to $30 a barrel, and said they're prepared to go lower because, one, the Saudis need cash. Number two, they want market share. And part of this was to Russia, this deal that broke apart with Russia. But the collateral damage here, and the huge damage, is in oil price, to attack the American, basically, oil industry. Now, President Trump and others saying, hey, well, this is great because it lowers prices to consumers. Yeah, that is. But remember, it's different when you're an oil importer and exporter. We now have one of the most vibrant, robust parts of the economy. And to be brutally frank about it, one of the best parts of the Trump movement has been this energy movement, right? Particularly with workers.
Right.
And, high value added jobs. And the Saudis came at that kind of gasoline on this entire thing. And, that dramatic cut, it will benefit consumers on the margins, but it will go to the heart of the American energy industry. That has to be sorted, and that's going to be something quite complicated because many of these companies they've lost a half to 60% of their stock market value. In addition, their bonds and their bank debt became subject to the incredible pressure, their ability to even pay this stuff off. So the entire energy sector, which is a major part of the Trump economic revolution, is now, quite frankly, in real extremis, and things are going to have to be worked out over the next coming days and weeks, but this is just adding to this. So yes, the virus and the pandemic, whether it's in, a recession that's going to happen in Europe, because, you could have all the Italian banks could fail in the next 2 weeks, right? Because Italy was entering a recession anyway, and now it's a country that's in total quarantine. So look, this thing's quite complicated, but that's why I would tell people they should just, you should not panic. This is nothing is inevitable, and get ahead of this. But there's a difference between not panicking and this kind of ill-informed complacency. Mm-hmm. And just like on the impeachment, and the reason, John, I talked to you when we started the impeachment show, is that somehow the Trump movement every now and again gets this kind of ill-informed complacency that everything's just going to be fine and everything's going to work out. Well, everything's not going to be fine. It's going to be fine if you take action, right? And now you're seeing President Trump, I think, step into this and take action. So, well, getting back at this, if we take action and then make sure we execute on that action,
right.
Things are just not going to get better by wishing things away.
All right, we got 4 minutes. A couple of quick items, Steve. I want to get to the virus. You've talked to some of the major doctors around the globe on your show, War Room Pandemic. The virus itself, how bad is this?
Well, it depends on, listen, the thing is fairly highly contagious. And for certain people, it can be, it depends on, and look, there's not a lot of data. So people are trying to figure out, is it about smokers? Is it about previous conditions, about age, et cetera? So, if you catch it and you see now what's happened in Italy, you've seen what's happened in Seattle, Washington, where we have, 20 some people that are dead. Right now, it hits people, and when it hits people, particularly, they don't know if the death rate here is 2.5% or if it's under 1%, because it's tough to find out how many people have actually been tested, right, in these different areas. What I would say is that if you think you've been exposed to it, you want to get a test. And now we've finally deployed this week supposedly millions of test kits. So if you think you've been exposed to it, for most people, and when I say most people, I think 90% of people that get this, it'll be the equivalent of getting a flu or getting a bad cold, right? Or some people be asymptomatic. But for some part of the population, right, it can be quite harmful. And for,
it can be fatal. I mean, over 70, breathing problems, but 90% of Americans who do get this, I was just reading before, half of those don't even have any idea they had it, just came and went, and it's gone. And the other half, they've had symptoms, but they just get over it. So it actually has an effect beyond the flu of a smaller percentage. But let me just ask this.
One thing. Here's the thing that we've seen is that in the world right now, it seems to have, when it breaks out, it seems to have concentrated either places like Wuhan, China, which had this devastating impact, or northern Italy, which right now is going through a major epidemic, about this pandemic, or around Qom, Tehran, or in Seattle, Washington. So it seems to it has breakouts, and it gets into a community, and that community has a lot of perturbations. And so seems to me, just observing this, that it's concentrated in South Korea. There's 5 or 6 places around the world, and you don't know where the next one's going to go. I would refer people. We put up on the site. There's tremendous amount of work being done at Johns Hopkins, at the Imperial College in London, at the Hong Kong University, the leading universities in the world that are SARS, that are literally virus hunters. And so you don't need Steve Bannon's. I got a C in biology my sophomore year at Benedictine, right? Steve Bannon's not I'm not an epidemiologist, but what we do is give access to the best information in the world so that you can make judgments yourself. And there's stuff out there about how this thing can spread and how deadly it is. But I think Steve, most people, you've got common sense stuff. Wash your hands.
Right.
Everything.
It's the same thing in your own home, right? I mean, you've got a bunch of people there, and you've got a big office. People come in. I mean, you just take the normal precautions. I got to read this text to you. I got a bunch of them. I'm going to pick one out. Eric in Richmond says, John, in all seriousness, ask Steve this: how do we know where the truth lies? I listen to War Room Pandemic every day, and then on your network, Prager comes on, Savage comes on, they pan what Steve says, and they basically say there's nothing to be concerned about. Where's the truth lie?
Here's where I say the truth lies. It's evidence-based. Just look at Wuhan, China. Look at northern Italy. Look at Qom, Tehran. Look at Seattle, Washington, right? Just look at where these outbreaks have had, the death rates, what's happened to the cities, they've had to shut this thing down from being expanded. I think in that regard, people should just go and let's look what the evidence is, right? We try to get total access to evidence. But here is Savage. I will take Steve Bannon's track record over their track record. You look at how I've been ahead of this thing. It was just,
No, that's true.
Now, I told people for a while that they were going to have a massive correction. You're going to have a massive financial reaction to this on top of the economics and on top of the evidence. And this kind of ill-informed complacency. There's enough information out there now at the top research universities with the top people in the world that people can make their own judgment. And look, if you're conservative, you believe in your ability of self-reliance. This is about kind of thing, and people have to do some work. I don't try to spoon feed you. What we try to do is give you access to the best information in the world. And I think people ought to do this. But this talk radio host stuff of just dismissing it, if people want to be led around by that, then be led around by it. But as part of being a conservative movement is self-reliance in your own individual judgment, and that to me is what we're trying to do, and what I would advise everybody to try to do.
All right, Steve. Final question here. We got to go. Phone rings at noon today. It's President Trump. What advice would you give him?
Number one, I would give him the advice that I think we got to get much more aggressive with the virus on testing. I think you got to be massive testing. You got to make sure it's out. We got to get test results. You got to find out how many people have this, and then you've got to take some pretty dramatic action. I think about the isolation of people who don't want to have it. You got to focus on taking hard, direct action by NIH, CDC, etc. And I would even think about using Northcom's, the biological teams, to help communities. In addition, I think you got to talk about hospitals, local healthcare, and particularly ICU beds. If you look throughout the world where they've had problems, in Italy and in Wuhan, China, where they didn't have the facilities and the medical people to take care of the sick, that small percentage that get sick get very sick, and they're very contagious. That's one of the problems, right? And it affects your public health. That's number one. Number two, on the economic side, you got to get down. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff you have to do on the interim for the travel and that, but you've got to get down to this supply chain, the medical supply chain. And we've helped people get production lines up and going in Texas with the masks. You got to get the masks, you got to get drugs, you got to get all that equipment's got to start being made in the United States. You have to take action to do it. We've got to bring the supply chains back here. We've got to start becoming more self-sufficient. And number three, you've got to step into this Wall Street situation and very smartly figure out how we're going to, put an end to this financial crisis, but you have to put actions in there so this thing can't happen again. And so those three areas of action, you've got a team around. But to me, it was the bold action. That's what people are looking for. No more tweets, no more talk. People are looking for action. The world's capital markets are looking for action, and the American people are looking for action. You do that, you're going to get reelected in a landslide. Don't. The re-election will take care of itself. This is the crisis. You've got to deal with this crisis. Everything else falls in place.
John Fredericks Radio Network. What a time. I want to thank Stephen K. Bannon for being with us.